Hello, YouTube. I know I'm late getting into this issue, but hey, I've been busy. Yes, I'm working on the AMA response video, and I'm just hearing about this now. What I'm referring to is a video by Sargon of Akkad entitled The Skeptic Community. First, let me address the issue of whether or not there is a skeptic community. If that's the name you want to give it, then I say there is no such thing. I have not seen any evidence that the online community I'm nominally a part of is characterized primarily by an overabundance of skepticism. What exactly, might I ask, is this community skeptical of? And why is it skeptical? If you want to claim it's skeptical of everything, I have to disagree, since almost every member of the community has demonstrated a lack of skepticism about one issue or another at some point. And if you're going to claim that it's skeptical of one particular issue, say feminism, then why are you calling it the skeptic community rather than something to do with feminism, the thing it's skeptical of? Now, if you wanted to say that there's such a thing as an anti-social justice warrior community, then fine, I think that's fair. After all, the thing that seems to bind most of us together is a dislike of the methods, tactics, and beliefs of the kind of people who can be labeled social justice warriors. But anti-SJW doesn't sound as cool or impressive as skeptic, so it's not the name that gets used. Well, I for one am not so arrogant as to label myself as a quote-unquote skeptic, because I don't think I'm any more skeptical in general than most people should be. Yes, there are plenty of people out there who show a disturbing lack of skepticism, but one could say the same about intelligence and wisdom, and I'm not about to label myself a member of the smart and wise community. But that's not really why I wanted to make this video. In his video, Sargon makes reference to the situation which involves harmful opinions and candid. Since I've made multiple videos about the genesis of that situation, linked below, I feel both qualified and compelled to reply to Sargon's comments. I'll play the relevant parts of his video now.
I think that when people make mistakes, we should not castigate and ostracize them, but deal fairly with them instead.
I agree with this to a certain extent, but it really depends on what you mean by treating them fairly. See, a lot depends on why the person made the mistake and how they themselves see the mistake. A mistake can represent a fundamental flaw in someone's character, and depending on the person, that flaw may be permanent. Thus, it's usually best to adopt an forgive but don't forget policy until the person proves to you that the mistake was not something likely to happen again. Personally, I think people in general have a very negative tendency to look upon people who have made a mistake then reformed better than they look upon those who never made the mistake in the first place.
A lot of people went hard at TJ, Armored Skeptic and Shu and others for doing sponsored videos by Candid, but they made a good point in their own defense. If the alternative media is to survive, it needs to be funded and it needs to be profitable. Any advertisers who want to work with content creators should be welcomed, even if you don't like the products that they are promoting.
I have to disagree with you there, Sargon. I understand from your perspective as a member of the alternative media, the most important thing is the media's growth and survival. But I have a different perspective and therefore a different viewpoint. I say that the way something grows determines its final form. If the alternative media, if that's what we're going to call large channels like The Amazing Atheist and Armored Skeptic, if it grows by immoral or otherwise shady means, then this alternative media may end up being no better than the current media. Let's not forget that it was the profit motive that most led to the downfall of mainstream media as a trusted source of news.
Because the people against us will happily shut us down by any means necessary to prevent us from not only speaking, but reaching the largest audience possible to prevent us from interrupting their narratives.
And you think that taking on every sponsorship that comes their way will prevent this alternative media from being shut down?
It is unreasonable to expect a content creator to know the full ins and outs of a sponsor when accepting the sponsorship.
I agree. It is, however, reasonable to expect a content creator to know that by accepting a sponsor, they're taking a risk. That risk is that if the sponsor turns out to be shady, they will be criticized for accepting the sponsorship in the first place. Ignorance is not a defense.
And while I personally wouldn't use Candid, and there may be ulterior motives behind it, I don't blame those who accepted the sponsorship because it made financial sense for them to do so.
I don't blame them either simply for accepting the sponsorship, but I also don't blame anyone who is critical of them for accepting the sponsorship. See, I'm a capitalist at heart, and I understand the need to get paid for what you do. I also, however, understand the inherent risk involved in signing any kind of contract, and especially one that involves your own integrity. To automatically forgive people for doing something just because it made financial sense for them to do so is the kind of blind capitalism that is partially responsible for the current corporate oligarchy we all live in. If you're operating a business for which one of your core assets is the trust of your audience, you can't sell that trust just to anyone and everyone just because it makes financial sense. You need to do a risk-reward analysis and consider whether you can trust the sponsor enough to be sure endorsing them won't cost you too much of the trust of your audience. I feel like most of the people who let Candid sponsor them didn't sit down and do a proper risk-reward analysis, and the criticism they now face is partially the result of that oversight.
I realise that there will be many who complain about the imperfection of this system, and their points are valid.
That's not how this works, Sargon. If the people who disagree with you have valid points, that means your argument is weak or incorrect. If this is so, why are you arguing what you're arguing? This sounds to me like an attempt to deflect criticism, but hand-waving so-called complaints as being valid, yet still claiming your own arguments to be correct, that's just not going to fly.
But politics isn't a game you get into and come out clean on the other side. If we want to get in the trenches and fight this culture war, we're going to have to define the acceptable amounts of mud sticking to our own, so the dialogue doesn't devolve into unhelpful backbiting.
I agree to a certain extent, but I think if that's the way you want to go, you're going to have to forget about this whole we business. The only way to do that and not come out as a hypocrite on the other side is to first clearly define your principles and then act accordingly. If your principles are to accept sponsorships from companies you don't have in-depth information about, you should be clear about this and allow anyone who disagrees with that principle to find someone else they like and respect. What you seem to be suggesting, though, is that members of the community who disagree with such principles should just shut up and go along with it because it's all for the greater good. But anyone who abandons their principles for some greater purpose risks becoming a hypocrite, and considering hypocrisy seems to me to be one of the things this community seems to really fight against the most, that's a dangerous method to be promoting. So yeah, sometimes in a war you need to get dirty to win, but winning in such ways isn't always worth it. Sometimes it's better to lose with your principles intact so that the next person to fight has a strong base on which to stand.
While I'm not a fan of sponsorship, it isn't necessarily an evil. Many sponsors do not have an ideological agenda and are purely interested in promoting their products to an audience who is willing to purchase them.
Are sponsorships all evil? Well, I think it depends. Trying to convince people to purchase or use a product they don't need or is not in their best interest to buy or use, that's a form of manipulation and I think can certainly fall under the category of evil. On the flip side, promoting a product you genuinely believe in and think other people would benefit from using, that can be a very positive thing. So really, I don't think sponsorship is a cut and dry thing where it's either all bad or all good. It very much depends on the thing being advertised and the person being sponsored.
One of the most dangerous social events to occur in any community is the devolution of the community into a witch hunt of ideological purity tests.
Yes, witch hunts are bad. Holding people to their stated principles? Not bad at all. I think actually that's a great thing. People who violate their stated principles need to be knocked down from whatever pedestal they are occupying until they either agree to change their behavior or they change their stated principles. Someone who claims to be in favor of accuracy and fairness, who promotes a product that uses Twitter and Wikipedia to verify the truthfulness of claims, such a person deserves all the criticism they get.
This is what happened with Candid. Many people suspected Candid's creators of having ulterior motives, and they may well have done, but that isn't the fault of the people they sponsored, and it isn't their responsibility, it's the responsibility of Candid's team.
Responsibility in this case is not an either-or proposition. The motives of the Candid team are of course the responsibility of the Candid team. The content creator's responsibility was to weigh the risks of being sponsored by a company they didn't know the motives of. It's perfectly fair, Sargon, to criticize people for who they choose to speak for. Say, if you're single and I set you up on a date with a woman claiming she's absolutely perfect for you, and then she turns out to be a manipulative liar, it's perfectly reasonable for you to be upset with me. It wouldn't be an acceptable excuse for me to say, well, I didn't know her for very long and she seemed nice, because I had claimed she was perfect for you. The people advertising Candid didn't say, well, I don't know much about this product, but you might like it. They actively encouraged people to use it and presented it as a great product. They're now paying the price for potentially being wrong about that.
The YouTubers do, of course, have a duty of care to discriminate between the sponsorships they accept, but the fiasco surrounding Candid became conspiratorial and dragged out far longer than can be expected from a reasonable vetting process.
Earlier you said you don't blame them because it made financial sense for them to accept the sponsorship. Now you're saying they have a, quote, duty to discriminate between the sponsorships they accept. On what basis should they discriminate? Just financial considerations, as you implied earlier? Or does their duty require them to look into the thing they're advertising in detail? You claim that in the case of Candid, it's unreasonable for the content creators to have known there were issues because it took so long for the revelations of those issues to come out. That sounds to me like you're trying to rewrite history. It's not like the issues harmful opinions revealed were time dependent. The only reason it took time for them to come out is because it took time for harmful opinions to notice them. Any of the content creators who chose to accept Candid sponsorship could have done the exact same research harmful opinions did, but they either chose not to or didn't see those issues as serious enough to reject the sponsorship. In either case, they still deserve criticism because they were either negligent or in violation of their stated principles.
Nobody likes a sellout, and the YouTubers who accepted sponsorships on Candid may well have been led up the garden path by them, but attacking them for not knowing in advance that which it took harmful opinions weeks to uncover is unfair.
I strongly disagree for a couple of reasons. For one, while they can't have been expected to know everything harmful opinions eventually uncovered, his initial video focused on things they easily could have discovered themselves. Second, you seem to be acting as though these people are only being criticized for the initial act of accepting the sponsorship in the first place. In reality, people like TJ are being criticized for not only accepting the sponsorship, but for doubling down on their support of Candid even after harmful opinions continue to reveal potential issues with the product. If, for example, the people who advertised Candid stopped all their support for it once they saw the potential issues with it, this whole thing would probably have blown over long ago. That's essentially what Bering did, and I may be wrong, but I don't think he's been criticized for this anywhere near as much as some other people.
The entire thing had become an ideological purity test, the accusation being that these YouTubers accepted something that might, at some point in future, endanger free speech. Therefore, it was just to attack them for it.
What you see as an ideological purity test, a phrase that has a distinctive negative connotation, by the way, I see as holding people to their stated principles. If someone claims that support of free speech is one of their core beliefs, then advertises a product that may be antithetical to free speech, it's perfectly reasonable to criticize them for it. The response these people should have had is to be humbled by this criticism and do some soul searching. I have not seen that kind of response from many people. Instead, I see people attacking anyone who criticized them or doubling down on their initial support of Candid.
This is a common form of self-aggrandizement in ideologically driven communities, and I think it is something of which we should be aware and guard against with the utmost vigilance.
You want to guard against a community making sure its more popular and well-known voices are people who genuinely share the same core beliefs as the rest of the community? Are you insane? What you're proposing is essentially giving a free pass to popular voices in the community for the sake of strengthening the community. Is that really the kind of community you want to build?
I would recommend taking a look at Laurie Penny's Twitter right now, if you want to see the end result of this, in which she was chewed out by Antifa supporters for daring to even acknowledge the humanity of Breitbart writers and supporters. She argued her case fairly, and the goalpost was shifted, until even mentioning the subject of her hit piece was forbidden. This concluded with Laurie Penny being accused of being a liberal collaborator with the Nazis, and I'm sure I don't need to point out how such a statement is utterly unhinged.
I actually disagree. What you saw with Laurie Penny is exactly the way our community should work, in a sense. See, Laurie Penny violated one of the core principles of the Antifa community, which is that you shouldn't acknowledge the humanity of people they label as Nazis. To allow Laurie Penny, who clearly doesn't share that belief, to be a leading figure in their community would make their community one of ideological hypocrites. It's clear that Laurie Penny doesn't belong in that community, and she should join a different one that better matches her values. So maybe you, Sargon, should consider that this Candid situation shows that some prominent members of what you call the skeptic community don't really belong in that community. Or maybe it's the people critical of them that don't belong. Either way, it may be the case that this is all the result of two or more distinct communities trying to function as one. And such an attempt is not likely to succeed. Now, to be clear, I'm not supportive of the methods of Laurie Penny's critics, but of their sentiment, just as I'm not supportive of anyone engaging in anything that could accurately be described as a witch hunt. I am, however, very supportive of people who hold the most popular voices in their community to a high standard, and especially of those people who use such people's own stated principles as a standard by which they judge them. And that's where I'm going to end my response. Sargon continues in his video to discuss the benefits of sponsorship in general and of Patreon in particular, and I find nothing particularly controversial or disagreeable in that part of the video. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, I'm Positive Improvement, and I wish you all the best.